Let me, at the outset, thank India Foundation for this opportunity to speak at the 4th CTC, and also make a confession that since I have been ambassador in Afghanistan, I do have a special weakness. So what I will say will definitely have an Indian flavor, but it will also reflect the Afghan point of view in many ways. Having said that, let me say that the hypothesis that AFPAC is the epicenter of terror has been so deeply researched, documented, and written about that there is very little that I can really add in trying to prove that point. So I'm quite tempted to use a Latin phrase we used in school in maths, QED, quod erat demonstrandum, which basically means it is proven what we started to prove. Having said that, I would still like to make 2 points. That the retreat of IS from Iraq and Syria, there is a likelihood of a large number of global jihadists and free-floating radicalized mercenaries to gravitate towards this region. We have seen signs of a fledgling Islamic State of Khorasan, which also has both a historical and a philosophical allure that they will come. The question is, will their entry be facilitated as it was in Syria? And the second is, of course, a purely Afghan perspective. When we talk of stabilizing Afghanistan or having policies for of ensuring that Afghanistan is not a theater of violence, it is wonderful to say it's an AFPAC problem. But when we have to focus on terror, I think there is a need to dehyphenate. And the focus only needs to be on Pakistan and not AFPAC, because Afghanistan is a victim of terror. It is a theater where the terrorists bred, trained, and equipped in Pakistan are getting unleashed, and it is challenging the international community. And Afghanistan, I can tell you, neither has the wherewithal nor the desire to become a center where it would both breed and export terror outside. They have enough problems of their own. Why then does Pakistan follow this policy? This is a question that should arise. Now, there are several reasons. We will really have to go back to history, but let's start with our partition. I think the partition of the subcontinent and its ambition in terms of territory, both towards the east on Jammu and Kashmir, and also, I fear, towards its west, because Pakistan was also very fearful of the Durand Line, which Ambassador Dogra will be talking about on the west, which cuts through the Pashtun heartland, led to the birth of the largest Islamic nation, which also became a nuclear weapon state later. But this itself gave it a sense of entitlement, both in terms of a parity with India, a different world vision, and more importantly, an ambition to be the leader of the Islamic Ummah. And of course, that has pitted it against India's multi-religious society, and this is a problem which is going to persist way beyond Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir problem, I am afraid. Pakistan is also driven, or its policies are driven by this terrible fear of Afghanistan and India joining hands. The military, being the only savior of this holy land, has found resonance among the people, and that is why this policy has been continued for so long. Of course, because of the disparities in size, they have relied on asymmetric warfare and an undeclared war, both on its borders, east and west. But the problem is that the ideology that has been infused in this Mujahideen is a challenge and a threat, not only to the region, but to global peace all across the world. While, of course, use of irregulars and tribals predates the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. We saw it in 1948. However, 79 was a turning point in a way that it legitimized use of jihad and use of violence and religion against the non-believers, and also believers which were apostates. So thus these two key elements of jihad and takfiri are the ones which you would have heard in the morning session are the key drivers which have continued this policy so long. Of course, Pakistan, because USSR retreated from Afghanistan, has also created a false narrative which actually feeds this Taliban insistence on continuing the war, that we actually defeated a superpower and we can perhaps take on the next one. I personally feel that this narrative is overblown, exaggerated, because the thing and the geopolitics has changed, and also the stormtroopers of that period have changed. If you look at it, all the Mujahideen forces which Pakistan supported against Soviet Union are now back in Afghanistan, including Hekmatyar. In fact, all of them are part of the national government today. They have completely divorced themselves from this ideology, except for Taliban. So I don't know whether they can repeat the same strategy again. Besides, the two main supporters of that Mujahideen, or this fight against the infidel Soviets, the Saudis and the US are no longer on the same page. In fact, they are perhaps on opposite sides today. So I don't know whether this narrative also needs to be questioned and questioned publicly. Of course, while there is this push factor, there is a pull factor, and I must confess that there are weaknesses in the Afghan society and governance. You heard Nabil Sahib yesterday. There are issues of ethnic divisions, corruption, lack of political cohesion, questionable elections, stagnant economic growth, and a flourishing criminal economy based on narco trade and illegal mining, kidnapping and blackmail, which has all, and these are the domestic factors which have sustained both the Taliban operations and also the small criminal groups which operate under the banner of Taliban in different parts of Afghanistan. I fear that as we enter the election years, parliamentary elections this year and presidential elections next year in Afghanistan, there would be greater efforts at destabilization. And of course, we have seen that the Shia-Sunni fault lines are now being increasingly used. And a number of Shia mosques have been attacked in Afghanistan, which was never the case. Afghanistan had its own brand of Islam, which perhaps corresponded more to the Sufi tradition, which was moderate, but that is sought to be changed through this radicalization. Of course, a weak, disunited government, which is in disarray, helps the people who don't want a stable and strong Afghanistan. And that is why, and that is what is critical in India's interest, that we should have a strong Afghanistan which is governed centrally from Kabul, so that Pakistan does not get access to ungoverned areas where it could locate these training camps as in the pre-2001 era, because that provides it deniability and respectability when its hands gets exposed outside or it gets questioned. In fact, Pakistan after 2001 continued for nearly 10 years, completely denying existence of Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, till one was located in Abbottabad and the other died in Karachi hospital. And once that has been exposed, one sees a certain brazenness in Pakistani public perceptions. In fact, if you have followed Pervez Musharraf, who ruled during that regime, he very proudly now boasts on television channels of how useful that has been as a tool for regional influence, both in India and both in Afghanistan, and of course for troubling and bleeding India. What next? President Ghani, in a very bold move, has offered Pakistan, the Taliban, unconditional talks. He has invited them even to open an office in Kabul. Now, the responses that you see from Taliban, of course, the responses came in 3 stages. First was an open letter to the US public, which was trying to drive a division, or obviously very keenly observing the American debate and the fatigue on this long war. They appealed to the American public that this is a war that you cannot win, so it is best to accommodate us. Second, that they responded to Mr. Barney Rubin, and I must say that Taliban leaders have learned very good English in the last 15 or 20 years that they had lived in Pakistan, and the letter came within 1 day of Barney Rubin's letter. But the two conditions now that they have put to Afghan government, I don't think will be accepted, which is 100% withdrawal of foreign troops and a 50% power sharing in entire country. Now you have to understand how the Afghan political system works today. After the last 2014 elections, there is already a 50-50 power sharing between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, and it's called the National Unity Government. So we are seeing a demand that Taliban wants to form a national unity government with the national unity government, which is already there, which has been elected democratically. So perhaps it is an opening gambit and maximalist demand, but I feel that opening of a Taliban office in Kabul may or may not be acceptable to the Pakistani handlers because they will lose the control that they have on them today. But then how do we deal with Pakistan? And keeping aside Jammu and Kashmir, first thing that we all have to do is to reject their victim narrative. In fact, it is undeniable that the Pakistani society has paid a heavy price in terms of human losses. But the fact is that if the military regime argues that they are one of the bigger victims of terror, I think it is not only a shameful denial, but it's also disingenuous, because it is nothing but a reflection of their own policies that they have followed since '79. Of course, there would be efforts to put pressure on the global stage. We have seen in the last 1.5 years several such efforts. SARC summit was not held. Then perhaps the biggest snub to Pakistan was the Islamic summit in Saudi Arabia, which was organized by Mohammed bin Salman and President Trump, when Nawaz Sharif, who reached Riyadh rehearsing his speech, was not even called to make a statement at an Islamic summit. And that was a major setback because it sees itself as a leader. It is the second largest in terms of population, plus a nuclear weapon state to boot, that he was not allowed to speak at that forum. Then, for the first time, BRICS declaration of last year, if you notice, that one paragraph was devoted, and the first time Pakistan-based terrorist organizations, which are also India-focused, were mentioned. And this was a big development as far as their permanent support from China is concerned. Iran, one of their neighbors, Iran has publicly threatened that they are willing to take action in Pakistani territory to neutralize the training camps in Balochistan. Now that's a big message. If you have 3 neighbors and all 3 of them have such a grievance against you, then there's something that Pakistan needs to introspect. Then, of course, US President's famous tweet of 3rd of January, or was it 2nd of January, about that Pakistan has only given lies and deceit as being a non-NATO ally was another wake-up call. Then their isolation at the Financial Action Task Force recently, where only Turkey stood with them till the end, and even China and Saudi Arabia actually sort of moved away from shielding it from the threat of censure. And I choose my words carefully because it is not yet put on a blacklist, and perhaps it may not even have an effect because Pakistan was on this gray list from 2012 to 2015, and it did not change its behavior. But the fact is that in today's world, when it is looking at greater economic development and investments, this is a major setback. And of course, but the fear is that the regional consensus against Taliban seems to be fractured today. There was a time when Russia, China, India were singing from the same hymn sheet. Today it is not so. Now, whether this sort of a policy of Russia and China or divergence from the regional consensus will continue despite evidence that it is Pakistan from where the terror groups that threaten them also operate or they find shelter in. When they realize that there is no distinction between state and non-state actors when it comes to Pakistan and the terror groups, I am not sure. We hope it will change. China is a particularly important actor in this, not only because it is a very close friend, but also because it has huge plans of investments of over $50 billion in CPEC. And none of these plans will fructify if Pakistan is overrun by over 80 terrorists that they have listed which operate in Pakistan, are given a free rein. So they will have to be checked. Now, whether China will be able to do that, I am not sure yet. But the fact is that China itself has an Islamist problem in Xinjiang, and that also would guide its own policies towards this region. On top of this, we see that there's a new narrative which is emerging, which is of Daesh. As Engineer Nabil yesterday mentioned, that they have not located Daesh in terms of people who have moved away from Iraq or Syria. These are all local guys. These are primarily, when it started in 2014, 2015, there was evidence that these were all from a particular tribe called Orakzai, which were also the backbone of TTP. And there were evidence collected by both NDS and the civil society in Afghanistan, which showed that it had some linkages with Pakistan. Perhaps it will take another Carlota Gall and Christine Fair another 10 years to discover these links. It may take 10 years, but we may find that it has perhaps a new chapter in the same book where we have seen that Pakistan has changed horses mid-course, from the Mujahideen to Hekmatyar, then from Hekmatyar to Taliban, and perhaps Daesh is the new incarnation because it creates a distance. The linkages with Taliban have been exposed. So it creates a distance if you can create a new phenomena called Daesh. First, it becomes global. You get on board Russia and China to start looking at Taliban in a more indulgent manner, because it's the old simple saying, if you have to make a line small, what do? You can either rub it off or draw a bigger line next to it. And that is perhaps what is happening. I don't have concrete evidence, but there are signs that this could be the reason. And when I say that Pakistan military, and I think the messages from the domestic developments are going back to it. They have a restive Balochistan. They have, of course, Sindh is not particularly happy. And this long Pashtun march is perhaps the greatest uprising you have seen. Some people call it the Pashtun Spring. We don't know. But the street chant that they used really captures the essence of what is behind this epicenter. And the street chant was in Urdu, "Ye jo dahshat gardi hai, iske piche vardi hai." And that is absolutely on the dot. It is the popular wisdom which has been captured. But besides that, what we need to do is to understand that what is the force which drives the political domestic agenda. And there, in fact, I must quote a very famous columnist, which in an op-ed wrote, and of course he's describing the ISI, but he calls it the masters of the dark art of invisible politics. Of course, I think that is the best he could do in terms of naming it. But one of the policy objectives, if we want to have some semblance of sanity, would be to rebalance the domestic institutions, where one institution seems to be overwhelming all the other, which is preventing Pakistan from having a normal life. So I'll stop here. I'll take questions, and you have a very interesting panel following me, including Christine Fair and Ambassador Dogra, to carry on this conversation. Thank you very much.